Neil pushed the folder across the glass conference table during our weekly team meeting. Everyone was there. 12 people watching as I opened it and saw the demotion letter inside. My title, Senior Director of Operations, had been crossed out and replaced with Operations Coordinator. A position 3 levels below where I had been that morning. "This isn't personal, Allison," Neil said, his voice carrying that practiced tone of corporate regret. "But we need someone to fall on the sword for the product launch delay. The board wants accountability, and unfortunately, you were the project lead." My hands didn't shake as I read the letter. Around the table, my colleagues stared at their laptops or the table, anywhere but at me. The silence was suffocating. Neil waited for me to cry or argue or beg. I did none of those things. "When does this take effect?" I asked, my voice steady. "Immediately. You'll still have your job, just a lower profile. We need to send a message to the team about responsibility." After the meeting, I was escorted by security to my new workspace. Not an office. Not even a cubicle. A windowless room that had clearly been a supply closet until someone shoved a desk inside. The fluorescent light overhead buzzed constantly. There was barely room to turn around. I sat down in the cheap chair and stared at the blank walls. 7 years of building this department, 7 years of exceeding every target, and this was my reward. A closet with a desk. Through the thin walls, I heard voices in the hallway. Neil's laugh rang out clearly. "Well, that's one problem solved. Sometimes you've got to clean house to make room for progress." Someone else, I couldn't tell who, responded in a lower voice. More laughter followed. They were celebrating my humiliation just outside my door. I opened my laptop and created a new folder. I titled it simply, Documentation. Then I began writing down everything that had happened that day, with timestamps and witnesses. My name is Allison Parrish. I am 34 years old, and this wasn't supposed to be my story. I had spent 7 years climbing through the ranks at TechCore Solutions, starting as a junior operations analyst and working my way up to senior director. I had built systems that increased efficiency by 40%. I had trained half the operations staff. I had made Neil look like a genius in front of the board more times than I could count. 3 months ago, I was being considered for vice president of operations. The board had interviewed me twice. My performance reviews were flawless. Everyone assumed the promotion was just a formality, a matter of timing. But then the product launch got delayed. A launch I had managed perfectly until Neil made changes behind my back. Changes he never told me about. Changes that created the very problems he now blamed me for. I didn't know then that he would get me like a stranger. The launch delay wasn't my fault, though Neil had successfully made it look that way. 6 weeks ago, I had presented a detailed timeline to launch our new software platform. Every milestone was carefully planned, every resource allocated, every risk identified and mitigated. The board approved it. We were on track to launch on schedule. Then Neil held a private meeting with the development team without telling me. He promised the board an earlier delivery date to impress them, cutting 2 weeks from my carefully constructed timeline. When the team couldn't meet his impossible deadline, he blamed my project management. I discovered this through an email chain that someone accidentally copied me on. Neil had told the developers not to mention the timeline change to me. He wanted me to look incompetent when we missed the original date he had secretly moved up. The delay that cost me my position was his mistake. My name just paid the price. I went to HR 3 days after my demotion. The HR director, Patricia, listened to my story with a sympathetic expression that I quickly realized was completely empty. She nodded in all the right places, made appropriate sounds of concern, but her eyes were cold. "These situations are always difficult," she said when I finished. "But sometimes it's best to let things blow over. Making a fuss will only make it harder for you to rebuild your reputation here." "Rebuild my reputation?" I repeated. "I didn't do anything wrong." Patricia leaned forward, lowering her voice as if we were conspirators. "Between you and me, Allison, the board needed someone to take responsibility. Neil positioned it as a learning opportunity for you. If you stay quiet and prove yourself in your new role, there could be opportunities down the line. I walked out of that office understanding a truth I had been too naive to see before. They weren't protecting me. They were protecting him. That weekend, I sat at my kitchen table with 7 years of files, emails, and documents spread around me. I started taking notes. Not angry rants or emotional outbursts, but careful, detailed documentation of every interaction that mattered. I noted dates, times, witnesses. I saved email chains showing Neil's instructions that contradicted his later claims. I documented meetings where decisions were made and who made them. I created a timeline of the product launch that showed exactly when and how Neil had altered my plan. It was methodical work. Boring work. The kind of work that required patience rather than passion. But I had learned something important during my 7 years in operations. Systems beat emotions every time. Documentation beat accusations. Evidence beat anger. If they wanted a scapegoat, they had picked the wrong person. I just needed to be smart about how I proved it. While organizing my files, I found something interesting buried in an old budget report. A recurring discrepancy in departmental spending that didn't quite add up. Neil had approved expenses that seemed inflated, redirected funds between accounts in ways that weren't quite transparent. I pulled quarterly reports from the past 18 months and laid them side by side. The pattern became clearer. Small amounts, never enough to trigger automatic audits, but consistent. Money flowing into vendor accounts for services that either weren't delivered or were significantly overcharged. Neil had been cooking the numbers. Not in an obvious way, but in a careful, systematic way that suggested he knew exactly what he was doing. The misreporting had been going on for months, maybe longer. I made copies of everything and stored them in 3 different locations. Then I continued building my case, piece by piece, knowing that patience was my greatest weapon now. I remembered a meeting from 6 months ago, back when the board was evaluating candidates for the VP position. One of the board members, Eleanor Brandt, had pulled me aside after my presentation. Eleanor was in her early 60s, with sharp eyes and a reputation for seeing through corporate politics. She had built her own company before selling it and joining several boards. People respected her because she didn't tolerate nonsense. "That was impressive work, Allison," she had said. "You have a gift for seeing systems clearly. That's rare." We had talked for 20 minutes about operational efficiency and leadership philosophy. As she left, she handed me her business card. "If you ever need to talk about anything, call me directly. Not through official channels. Just call." I had thought it was a polite gesture at the time. Now I understood it might have been something more. Eleanor had been in this industry long enough to recognize the signs of someone being set up or pushed aside. Maybe she had seen something I hadn't noticed yet. 3 weeks after my demotion, I ran into Eleanor in the elevator. She was visiting the office for quarterly board meetings. When she saw me, her expression shifted from polite recognition to something harder to read. "Allison Parrish," she said as the doors closed. "I heard about your reassignment. How are you managing?" The question was loaded. This wasn't small talk. "I'm adjusting," I said carefully. "Learning to work within new constraints." Eleanor studied me for a moment. "Neil's been sloppy lately. People notice these things, even when they think no one's paying attention. The board evaluates more than just what gets presented in meetings." The elevator reached her floor. As the doors opened, she paused. "Remember what I told you. If you need to talk, call me directly." Then she was gone, leaving me with the clear understanding that I had an ally on the board. Someone who saw what was happening and was waiting to see what I would do about it. Despite my demotion, I still had access to the shared drives and project files. Neil assumed I would retreat quietly into my closet office and stop paying attention to what happened in the department I had built. He was wrong. I watched as he prepared for his quarterly board presentation. He was using my strategy deck, the comprehensive operations improvement plan I had developed over 6 months. My name wasn't mentioned anywhere in his presentation. He had simply replaced my attribution with his own, presenting my work as his vision for the department. I sat in my closet office, monitoring the shared files, and felt disgust wash over me. But underneath that disgust was something colder and more useful. Restraint. Because I had something better than anger now. I had time. Time to watch him make mistakes. Time to document his incompetence. Time to build a case so comprehensive that no amount of corporate politics could save him. I created what I privately called the Canary document. A detailed analysis of our operational metrics with one critical flaw. The data projections used an outdated baseline that would make our efficiency gains look much better than they actually were. The file looked perfect. Professional formatting, comprehensive charts, impressive conclusions. But the underlying math was wrong in a subtle way that would only become obvious when someone tried to verify the numbers against actual performance data. I placed it in a shared folder where Neil regularly looked for materials to use in his presentations. Then I waited. 3 days later, he took the bait. I watched through the file's version history as he copied my Canary document into his board presentation. He didn't check the calculations. He didn't verify the sources. He just assumed it was correct because it looked good and made him look better. I had the original version with correct data saved separately, with full documentation of when I created each version. Version control receipts that would prove exactly when the flawed document was created and when Neil used it. Something unexpected started happening in the weeks after my demotion. People throughout the company began seeking me out. Junior staff members came to my closet office with questions about processes and procedures. Other department heads asked for my input on operational problems. At first, I thought it was pity. But gradually I realized it was something else. My demotion had been so obviously unfair that it had damaged Neil's credibility more than mine. People saw through the scapegoating. They knew who actually kept the operations running. I helped everyone who asked. I answered questions, solved problems, supported projects. I never complained about my demotion. I never spoke badly about Neil. I just did excellent work from my terrible office and let my results speak for themselves. The interns started calling me the real VP. I didn't correct them. I just smiled and continued building relationships that Neil was systematically destroying through his incompetence. As the quarterly board meeting approached, Neil's anxiety became visible. He was sweating through presentations to his own staff. He snapped at people who asked reasonable questions. His usual smooth confidence was cracking under the pressure of having to defend results he didn't actually understand. 2 weeks before the board meeting, he did something I hadn't expected. He came to my closet office and knocked on the door frame. When I looked up, he was standing there with a folder of documents, his expression a mixture of desperation and false friendliness. "Allison, I need your help with something," he said, as if the past month hadn't happened. As if he hadn't publicly humiliated me and stolen my work. "What do you need?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "These operational metrics for the board presentation. Some of the numbers aren't matching up with what I expected. Can you take a look?" I took the folder. Inside were the reports based on my Canary document. "I'll review it and get back to you." I spent that evening carefully analyzing what Neil had sent me. He had built his entire board presentation around the flawed projections from my Canary document. Now he was discovering that the numbers didn't match reality, but he couldn't figure out why. I sent him back a response that was technically accurate but carefully incomplete. I explained some of the discrepancies in ways that would make sense on the surface but wouldn't actually solve his underlying problem. I gave him just enough information to dig himself deeper into the hole he had created. This wasn't revenge anymore, I wrote in my private documentation that night. It was correction. Bringing reality back into alignment with truth. Every interaction with Neil went into my files. Every email, every request for help, every moment where he demonstrated that he didn't understand the work he had stolen from me. I was building something comprehensive and undeniable. Eleanor sent me a calendar invitation 4 days before the board meeting. Lunch at a restaurant across town, far from the office. Just the two of us. No agenda listed. I accepted immediately. We met at a quiet Italian place where business people went for private conversations. Eleanor was already seated when I arrived, reviewing documents on her tablet. She looked up and gestured for me to sit. "Thank you for meeting me, Allison. I'll get straight to the point. I've been watching what's happening in your department, and I don't like what I see. Neil's performance has been declining while he simultaneously took credit for improvements that stopped the moment you were demoted. I said nothing, just waited for her to continue. I need to ask you a direct question, and I need an honest answer. Eleanor leaned forward. If we removed him, could you take his place? Could you step into a VP role and actually lead that department? I had prepared for this conversation without knowing it was coming. Over lunch, I shared carefully selected evidence with Eleanor. The budget discrepancies showing financial misreporting. The documented instances of Neil stealing credit for my work. The timeline proving that the product launch delay was caused by his interference, not my management. I showed her email chains, version histories, witness statements from team members who had seen what happened. Everything was organized, time-stamped, and verifiable. Eleanor reviewed each piece of evidence with the careful attention of someone who had seen corporate fraud before. Her expression grew harder as she read. This is more serious than I thought, she said finally. The budget irregularities alone would be grounds for termination. Combined with everything else, this is a pattern of unethical behavior. She closed her tablet and looked at me. We'll handle it from here. The board meeting is in 4 days. I need you to be ready. Can you do that? Yes, I said simply. Eleanor nodded. Good. Don't change anything about how you're acting. Keep doing your work. Let him think he's safe. The day before the board meeting, I was walking through the executive floor when I passed a conference room where Eleanor was talking with 2 other board members. The door was open. Eleanor saw me and waved me in. Allison, do you have a moment? We had some questions about the operational improvements from last quarter. I stepped inside. The other board members smiled and asked intelligent questions about metrics and processes. We talked for 15 minutes about department performance, strategic initiatives, and future opportunities. Neil walked past the conference room halfway through our conversation. He stopped, frozen in the doorway, staring at me casually discussing operations with 3 board members. His face went pale. What's this meeting about? He asked, his voice tight. Eleanor looked up pleasantly. Just reviewing some performance data. Nothing formal. We'll see you tomorrow at the board meeting, Neil. I smiled at him. See you tomorrow. He walked away quickly, and I could practically feel his panic radiating down the hallway. The board meeting took place in the largest conference room on the executive floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city. A long table seated 15 people. The 5 board members sat at one end. Neil stood at the other, his presentation displayed on the massive screen behind him. I wasn't supposed to be there. But Eleanor had requested my presence as a departmental resource in case technical questions arose. I sat in a chair along the wall, my laptop closed on my knees, watching Neil prepare to present stolen work based on flawed data. He went through his slides with practiced smoothness. Revenue projections, efficiency improvements, cost savings. All of it impressive. All of it based on my Canary document's incorrect calculations. The board members listened politely. They asked a few questions that Neil answered with confidence. He was hitting his stride, probably believing he had weathered the storm. Then Eleanor spoke. These figures are quite impressive, Neil. Can you walk us through how you calculated the efficiency gains? The numbers don't match the system logs from the same period. Neil's confidence fractured. I'm sorry, which system logs are you referring to? Eleanor pulled up data on her tablet. The automated tracking system that monitors all operational processes. It shows a different baseline than what you're presenting. The efficiency improvement appears to be about 18%, not 34% as shown in your slides. That must be a different measurement period, Neil stammered. No, Eleanor said calmly. I'm looking at the exact same dates you reference in your presentation. Can you explain the discrepancy? Neil looked at me desperately, but I kept my expression neutral. This was his presentation, his stolen work, his problem to solve. Another board member spoke up. Neil, these operational improvements you're highlighting. When exactly did you implement them? Over the past 6 months, Neil said, regaining some composure. It's been a comprehensive departmental restructuring. I remained silent, but Eleanor nodded to me. This was my cue. Actually, I said quietly from my seat along the wall, those operational improvements were implemented over the past 14 months. I can provide the original documentation if that would be helpful. Eleanor nodded. Please do, Allison. I opened my laptop and pulled up the real data. The complete project timeline showing when each improvement was designed and implemented. The accurate metrics showing actual efficiency gains. The documentation proving that every innovation Neil was presenting had been developed before my demotion. I walked to the presentation screen and displayed the evidence. Side-by-side comparisons. Neil's slides using my work without attribution. The version histories showing when documents were created and by whom. The budget reports showing his financial misreporting. You demoted the person who did the work, Eleanor said, her voice hard. And then you stole it as your own. Is that an accurate summary, Neil? Neil's face was red. He tried to speak, started several sentences, but couldn't form a coherent defense. The evidence was overwhelming. The head of the board, William Strickland, spoke for the first time. His voice was cold and formal. Neil, I think it's best if you step out while we discuss this situation. Security will escort you to your office. This is a misunderstanding, Neil protested. Allison is clearly trying to sabotage me because she's bitter about her demotion. This is revenge. The documentation speaks for itself, William said. Please leave. 2 security officers appeared at the door. Neil looked around the room desperately, searching for an ally. He found none. Every board member's expression was closed and professional. His reign was over, and everyone in the room knew it. As he walked toward the door, he glared at me. I met his eyes without flinching, without satisfaction, without anything but calm certainty that justice was being served. The door closed behind him. Eleanor turned to me. Allison, please stay. We have questions about the actual state of the operations department. The board meeting continued for another 2 hours. This time, I was the one presenting. I walked them through the real metrics, the actual project timelines, the true state of departmental efficiency. I explained the budget irregularities I had discovered and provided documentation of Neil's misreporting. They asked hard questions. I answered every one with data and evidence. This wasn't about blame or revenge. It was about ensuring the board understood what had actually been happening while Neil created his false narrative of success. At the end of the meeting, Eleanor announced their decision. Effective immediately, Neil Anderson's employment is terminated. Allison Parrish will serve as interim vice president of operations while we formalize the transition. There was no applause. This was business, not celebration. But several board members nodded at me with respect that felt earned rather than given. You'll report directly to the board for the next 90 days, William said. After that, we'll evaluate whether to make the position permanent. Can you handle that responsibility, Allison? Yes, I said. But I need to make some changes to the department structure. Neil built a system that rewarded politics over performance. That has to change. Eleanor smiled slightly. Then change it. You have our support. My first week as interim VP was spent cleaning house. Not firing people out of revenge, but restructuring the toxic culture Neil had built. I promoted talented people who had been overlooked because they didn't play political games. I implemented transparent performance metrics so everyone knew where they stood. I dismantled the fear-based management system and replaced it with one built on trust and accountability. The junior staff member who had accidentally copied me on the email revealing Neil's timeline manipulation got promoted to project manager. The operations analyst who had tried to warn me about budget irregularities became my deputy director. The intern who kept calling me the real VP got offered a full-time position. We don't need fear to lead, I told my new management team in our first meeting. We need trust, transparency, and people who are actually good at their jobs. That's what we're building here. The department transformed quickly. Morale improved. Efficiency actually increased beyond even my original projections. People stopped looking over their shoulders and started focusing on their work. 90 days after my interim appointment, the board called a special meeting. I arrived prepared for anything, including the possibility that they would bring in an external candidate for the permanent VP position. I had proven myself, but boards were unpredictable. William opened the meeting with a smile, the first time I had seen him express genuine warmth. "Allison, we've reviewed your performance over the past 3 months. The department is running more efficiently than it has in years. Employee satisfaction scores are up 43%. You've identified and corrected financial irregularities that could have become serious problems. And you've done all of this while being remarkably gracious about how you were treated." Eleanor added, "The board has voted unanimously to offer you the permanent position as Vice President of Operations, along with a compensation package that reflects your actual value to this company." The offer they presented was more than generous. It was recognition that I had earned not just through competence but through character. Through choosing to build rather than destroy, even when I had every right to be bitter. I accepted on the spot. They gave me Neil's old office, the corner space with windows overlooking the city that I had walked past so many times on my way to my closet. The first time I stood in that office, looking out at the skyline, I felt something settle inside me. The space felt smaller than I remembered. Less impressive. Maybe because I had outgrown the person I was when I used to envy it. I moved my things in slowly, deliberately. On the credenza behind my desk, I placed a small photo of my team on the day we launched the product that Neil tried to take credit for. A reminder of what real success looked like. Over the following months, people would ask me how I survived what Neil did to me. How I came back from such a public humiliation. They wanted a story about revenge or clever manipulation. But that wasn't what happened. I didn't survive through revenge. I survived through documentation, patience, and refusing to let someone else's assessment of my worth become my reality. Neil tried to erase me from my own success. He tried to diminish me into nothing. All he did was sharpen my edges, teaching me exactly how strong I could be when I stopped waiting for permission to prove my value. I learned that knowing your worth isn't about making others see it. It's about seeing it so clearly yourself that no one else's blindness can diminish it. And sometimes, if you're patient and build your case carefully, the truth finds its way to the people who matter. The board meeting where I was permanently appointed VP happened exactly 1 year after Neil demoted me in that glass conference room. 1 year from being humiliated in front of my peers to leading the department I had built. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, methodical, and arrives exactly when it should. And when it does, it's not revenge. It's just truth finally catching up with lies.